days on the razor's edge, Ukraine is now a nation at war. Just hours ago, Russian forces began their attack. President Vladimir Putin warning other countries that any attempt to interfere with the Russian action will lead to, quote, consequences they have never seen.
The 24th of February 2024 marks the 2-year anniversary of Russia's initial assault on Ukraine in 2022. It is not just the second anniversary of a regional conflict between two nation-states. Instead, it also marks a drastic reorientation of the international political situation, as Russia confirmed its status as a pariah state under the control of Vladimir Putin. Similarly, the conflict has had large implications for the wider world, with the economic unrest it has unleashed creating a vast swathe of economic, social, and problems in many countries around the world, notably by unleashing a new migrant crisis in Europe and exasperating the post-pandemic inflation crisis. Here we take stock of where the war stands 2 years in, the devastation it has wrought in Ukraine, and its global impact. Most of us are familiar with the conflict and how it came about, but let's just briefly recap. Ultimately, its origins go back to the 18th century, when Russia conquered much of what are now eastern Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula in wars against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Ottoman Empire. It continued to control Ukraine down to the early 1990s, though the distinct identity of Ukraine was acknowledged by the Soviet Union when it was formed into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in 1919. At the end of the Cold War, Ukraine became an independent country in 1991, though one which retained close ties to Russia. What changed matters was the Maidan Revolution of late 2013 and early 2014 in Ukraine, when the pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych was removed from power and a new administration signaled its intent to form closer ties with the European Union and the American-led military alliance NATO. In response, Vladimir Putin, who views himself as a latter-day Russian Tsar, rebuilding the Russian Empire of the 18th and 19th centuries, invaded Ukraine in the spring of 2014, annexing Crimea and occupying the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in the east of the country. In reality, the Russo-Ukrainian War began at this point in 2014. However, Putin was anxious to avoid sundering relations with the US and the rest of Europe at this juncture, and so the war was limited to the east of Ukraine and fought primarily through proxies rather than directly by the Russian military. This situation prevailed for 8 years, with peace negotiations entered into intermittently. What changed matters was when talks towards Ukraine becoming a member of NATO intensified in 2021, and also as Putin began to perceive a growing weakness in the Western world, which encouraged him to expand the war with the goal of conquering all of Ukraine. Thus, in late February 2022, a new phase of the conflict began. When he invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Vladimir Putin had aimed for a swift and total victory over Ukraine by quickly occupying the east of the country and capturing the capital Kyiv, as well as the main southern port city, Odessa. It didn't work out this way. The Ukrainian military has proven to be far more resilient and effective than had been anticipated, while the Russians have continued in a long tradition stretching back to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, by which Russia has been able to employ large armies which perform very poorly and are tactically unsophisticated, instead relying on sheer force of numbers to overcome an enemy. Consequently, the attack on Kyiv failed utterly, while Odessa also remains firmly under Ukrainian control. Where Russia has succeeded to some extent is in consolidating control over much of eastern Ukraine, in particular by securing a land corridor running from Donetsk all the way southwestwards along the northern shore of the Sea of Azov to the Crimean Peninsula. This involved intense fighting over the cities of Mariupol and Melitopol, but efforts to push further westwards from there have stalled, with the war largely becoming an over-and-back clash to secure control of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia in 2023. One of the things that has become evident in the process is how unprepared modern nation-states are for sustained warfare of this kind. Ukraine has been highly reliant on its Western allies to keep it supplied with munitions and armoured vehicles, while Russia, despite having one of the world's largest militaries, has had to resort to deals with Iran and even North Korea to supply it with drones, ammunition, and incendiaries. This has been one of the bloodiest wars of the 21st century, and the worst in Europe since the Second World War. Estimates of casualties vary greatly, in large part because Russia has been anxious to understate its losses in order to make it seem that it has been faring better in the fighting than it is in reality, while Ukraine has also sought to counter Russia's outlandish claims about hundreds of thousands of dead Ukrainians. Despite these issues, it seems clear that nearly 20,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed, with upwards of 45,000 Russian dead. Approximately 10,000 civilians have also lost their lives, 560 being children. One will often see higher casualty figures cited. This is when the wounded are included, and there is no doubt that cumulatively, hundreds of thousands of people have suffered injuries of some kind. In many instances, these are life-altering. At least 20,000 people are officially recorded as having to undergo amputations of a leg or arm since February 2022, though experts suspect that the actual figure may be as high as 50,000. No matter what way it is looked at, this has been a brutal conflict. The only consolation is that civilian casualties peaked very early on in March 2022, during which month over 4,000 civilians were killed, before declining to under 1,000 casualties in April 2022. Since the beginning of 2023, the average number of civilian casualties every month has been below 200, indicating that while this vicious conflict continues, at least it has largely become concentrated into a fight between opposing militaries, rather than one of mass civilian deaths. While the human loss is surely the most important, the destruction wrought by the war in terms of infrastructure and economic damage has also been immense. One report in the early autumn of 2022 estimated that by the 1st of June 2022, just over 3 months after the invasion began, $97 billion worth of damage had been inflicted across Ukraine, most of it occurring in the east of the country, where cities like Mariupol have been almost completely destroyed. While Mariupol garnered international headlines owing to the long siege of the huge steelworks there in 2022, other cities and towns that have barely been reported on internationally have also been obliterated. Popasna was a town of 20,000 prior to the invasion, which is a series of ruins now with just a few hundred people living there today. The larger city of Bakhmut has lost virtually its entire pre-war population of 70,000 people, and its large apartment buildings and factories have been reduced to bombed-out husks. Then there are the less visible but equally sinister elements of the destruction caused by the war. It is, for example, estimated that 174,000 square kilometers of land across eastern Ukraine, along with parts of central Ukraine and along the northern border, have been contaminated by landmines and other explosive devices. That is an area of land half the size of Germany. Even were peace established tomorrow in Ukraine, people would still be dying from landmines exploding years from now. The damage inflicted by the war has been felt far beyond the front lines of the conflict. Economic damage can be as severe in the modern world, where interruptions to supply lines and economic crises lead indirectly to deaths owing to lack of medicines, access to appropriate healthcare, and many other factors. The war unleashed a torrent of economic damage of this kind as Ukraine's Western allies responded to Putin's actions by imposing wave after wave of economic and financial sanctions against Russia. In tandem, this led to an enormous spike in the cost of oil and gas, as Europe had foolishly become hugely reliant on Russian gas to meet its energy needs since the 1990s. It really is difficult to assess the precise impact of this. For instance, a poor elderly person in northern Scotland who refrained from sufficiently heating their home in the winter of 2022 because they couldn't afford the exorbitant gas bills at that time might not be considered a direct casualty of the war thousands of kilometers away in Eastern Europe if they die from the cold. But there is little doubting that there is a connection there in terms of the consequences of the conflict. More broadly, quality of life in many countries has been damaged owing to the economic crisis which the war created. The global economy was already experiencing severe inflationary pressures coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, owing to the huge amounts of state supports that were offered to people during lockdowns when they could not work. This was further exacerbated by the drastic spike in oil and gas prices, and those of other commodities in the first half of 2022 as the war broke out. The impact is still being felt 2 years later, particularly for mortgage holders, as central banks around the world have been forced to raise interest rates heavily, this bizarrely being the only weapon they have to try combat inflation. Yet, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the greatest burden has always fallen on the people of Ukraine. The typical metrics used to judge economic activity, such as GDP and GNP, really do not provide an accurate picture in this instance, as those metrics have remained reasonably high as the country has shifted to a wartime economy. Building armoured vehicles, for instance, can create the veneer of economic buoyancy, but armoured vehicles do not generally improve an individual person's quality of life. Thus, while Ukraine's economic metrics recovered immensely in 2023, life in the country remains difficult, particularly so the further east one goes, while random bombings of cities like Lviv in the west point towards the psychological pall that continues to hang over people everywhere in the country. Perhaps the foremost impact of the war on the global economy has been on the supply of grain, wheat, and other stable crops. A European Commission report produced in 2022 estimated that Ukraine, a very large but comparatively thinly populated country, was producing 10% of the world's wheat, 13% of the world's corn, and a huge 15% of the world's barley before the war began. The invasion not only led to the abandonment and destruction of vast stretches of agricultural land, but also led to a Russian blockade of Odessa and other ports through which Ukraine grain and wheat were exported internationally. Consequently, wheat prices spiked to an all-time high in the first months of the year, with the average ton of wheat and grain selling in the late spring and early summer of 2022 to nearly twice what they had cost in the summer of 2021. World markets have readjusted since, and alternate supply routes have been developed, such that prices globally have returned to their pre-war level. But the huge spike added to global inflation in 2022 and early 2023 further fractures the international situation. The full political and socio-economic impact of all this are still unknown. The inflation which the war compounded has led to a cost of living crisis in the Western world, which has already, to a substantial degree, seen far-right parties make unprecedented gains in elections in countries like Italy and the Netherlands. Half the population of the world's democracies are set to vote in elections in 2024, and it seems inevitable that further gains will be made by far-right parties with a further erosion of democratic norms. There is more than one reason why this is occurring, notably the apathy and lethargy of upper-middle-class elites in responding to the struggles of the working classes ever since the 2008 financial crash. But some of it is directly related to the war in Ukraine and the chaos it unleashed globally in 2022. A further element of all this has been the refugee crisis which the war created. Ukraine is a country which had nearly 45 million inhabitants prior to the war. The level of displacement has been enormous. Consider that the city of Mariupol had nearly 500,000 inhabitants before the war, the vast majority of which fled as the siege of the city began. And it was just one of many large industrial cities in eastern Ukraine that are on the front lines. Elsewhere, people have trickled out of Kyiv and other cities in central Ukraine that might not be on the front lines of the conflict, but which nevertheless are still subject to frequent aerial bombings and other hardships. Unsurprisingly, millions of people have left Ukraine altogether, while the first months of the war, when it seemed plausible that Russia might conquer much of Ukraine, saw a mass refugee crisis as people fled into Poland, Romania, and other countries. The burden of this has fallen most heavily on Ukraine's immediate neighbours, Poland, for instance, who have taken in 1.5 million refugees, though the number of Ukrainians that have transited through Poland and then onto other European countries exceeds 5 million. In total, it is now estimated that well over 6 million Ukrainians have left their home country and are living in various parts of Europe. A further 8 million Ukrainians are internally displaced, with large numbers of people being resettled in the west of the country away from the front lines. Unfortunately, the refugee crisis has created problems, as pressure on housing, services, and other resources across European states owing to the influx of Ukrainian refugees is resulting in a backlash against migration, with far-right, anti-migrant political parties set to make large gains in the European Parliament elections of June 2024. The impact on global international relations of the war has also been acute. For 30 years since the end of the Cold War, the Western world had held out hopes that Russia would one day become a fully reformed Western-style democracy. The expansion of the war in 2022 shattered that misguided delusion, and a new species of Cold War between Russia and the Western world has emerged. This has been the more obvious element of how the conflict has altered international relations. There are much more subtle elements to it though. For instance, India's unwillingness to unilaterally condemn Russia or to align itself with Washington and Brussels on the conflict has led to a major rethink in Western capitals about whether the world's largest democracy can really be considered a strong Asian ally. Conversely, China's tepid support for Russia at certain junctures has reassured some Western policymakers that the alliance between Xi Jinping and Putin is not as firm as speculated, though this is most likely born out of China's desire to act as a peace broker down the line and thus affirm its position as a rival to the US on the global stage. More broadly, the manner in which Russia was able to bypass Western sanctions and simply arrange to sell its oil to Asia and Africa, while the Saudis and others increased their supply to Europe and North America, points to the manner in which large sections of the developing world are willing to act in economic alliance with one another against European and American interests. While Russia may not be isolated on the world stage as a result of the invasion, as many in Washington, Brussels, Berlin, London and Paris would like, Ukraine has also become more connected as a consequence of the war. Contrary to Putin's desire to block Ukrainian membership of NATO, the war has actually accelerated Ukraine's application to join, while NATO has also expanded in Northern Europe, with Finland having joined in 2023 and Sweden about to join. Ukraine and Moldova, the latter being another former Soviet republic that is subject to Russian interference in its affairs, were also accepted for candidate status to join the European Union late in 2023. Yet it hasn't been all good news for the EU and NATO. The conflict has created some internal tensions, notably within the EU, where Hungary's quasi-dictator Viktor Orban has taken a pro-Russian stance with the EU and impeded European aid packages being granted to Ukraine. In contrast to the sense of common purpose and unity which the war has instilled in the Ukrainian people, the conflict has created unprecedented problems for Vladimir Putin at home in Russia. In the first weeks of the war in the spring of 2022, there were many prominent media figures that condemned the invasion, introducing a level of dissent into the Russian public sphere that is not usually seen. Still, polls indicated widespread support for the war. That is until the damage it was creating socially and economically within Russia became apparent, as Western companies left Russia and other economic damage ensued from Western sanctions. Then the war effort soured, compounding public resentment. All of this boiled over in the summer of 2023, as Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Russian mercenary outfit, the Wagner Group, began vocally criticizing the regime and its handling of the war. On the 23rd of June, this boiled over into an outright revolt against the government, as Prigozhin sent armed divisions northwards to Moscow. In what was surely one of the most bizarre mutinies in modern history, he then decided to abandon the mutiny the following day, and was unsurprisingly killed just 2 months later in a mysterious/unmysterious airplane crash. While Prigozhin was soon dispensed with by Putin, the mutiny nevertheless pointed towards the fundamental weakening of the Russian dictator's authority, as crowds of supporters were seen openly cheering Prigozhin's Wagner units on the streets of Rostov-on-Don during the rebellion. It all pointed towards the manner in which the war had undermined Putin's authority, leading to the most serious challenges to his rule since he took over the Russian government nearly a quarter of a century ago. From all of this, it should be entirely clear how destructive, damaging, and destabilizing the war in Ukraine has been. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed and wounded, large sections of eastern Ukraine have been destroyed, and are now covered in mines and other things which will make them broadly uninhabitable for years to come. And the world has been massively destabilized by it, both economically and politically. And yet, there seems to be little chance of a decisive military breakthrough on either side at this stage. Instead, after the major offensives and counteroffensives of 2022 and early 2023, since the summer of 2023, the war seems to have descended into a stalemate, with both sides fighting over small stretches of devastated land in eastern Ukraine. Comparisons with the First World War, where the British, French and Germans fought over a stretch of northeastern France that was bombed out and churned up for 4 years, have been made. Stalemate is now the military situation to a large extent, as any breakthrough by Russia immediately meets with increased military aid to Ukraine from America and Europe, which then reverses the Russian gains. It is hard either to see an end to the war through diplomatic means anytime soon, unfortunately. As the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Josep Borrell, has noted, the conflict is a war of choice of President Putin, and he is the one who has to stop it. There is little to suggest that Putin will be willing to countenance doing so unless Ukraine is prepared to acknowledge Russia's annexation of Donetsk, Luhansk and the Crimea. Kyiv will not accept these terms, and so the war will go on. At present, the best that can be hoped for is a gradual de-escalating of the conflict, where both sides scale down the forces being used and the resources being expended, so that the war returns to being a species of regional limited conflict in eastern Ukraine, much as it was prior to the expansion of the war in February 2022. Then, years from now, Putin's death might allow for an end to the conflict.